and how music of our past enters into the present. And in a sort of broader non-musical sense, thinking about inheritance, which we can get into in more detail. And I'm just going to apologize now. You will probably hear me say a few of these things again just before the concert, so bear with us when it's repeated.
So this piece, Heirloom, and I want to talk about your role in the Oregon Symphony as well, but let's talk about Heirloom. 3 movements, piano concerto, and I know this is about cultural inheritance, musical inheritance, but also national inheritance. And these 3 movements represent, when you and I were talking earlier this week, it struck me that things that are very, very hard, very difficult, and also very, very sweet, especially the piece that was inspired by the story about your daughter.
Yeah.
But I don't want to put words into your mouth. Can you talk through a little bit about that?
Well, I think, you know, in order to talk about this piece, I'm really talking about my family. It is called Heirloom. My dad is an extraordinary musician. Well, thank you.
Jeffrey Kahane.
I mean, I'm biased, but he had a very interesting musical upbringing. He was steeped in opera as a child, and he was, I think, a little bit of a snob, but he had, you know, he also had an older brother, and his older brother was a hippie, and so of course my dad fell in love with the guitar and with folk music and ended up playing in bands as not just as a teenager, but as a tweenager, with various friends, including a woman named Martha, whom he would then marry, who is my mother. And all the while he was studying Beethoven and Brahms and went off to the conservatory when he was 15. And I think he tried to reconcile his love of folk music and of concert music, Western classical music, at a time when there wasn't really a clear path for people who wanted to do that vocationally. What he wanted to do then has become somewhat of a commonplace now. I am a figurehead of that. I tour in clubs, I sing in dirty bars with, you know, that smell of beer, and then I come and do stuff like this. And I'm not the only one, there are many of us. But my father was trying to do concerts like this in 1971, 1972, and there was no precedent for that. There was no roadmap for how to do that. So in one sense, the first movement is not only about my musical inheritance from my father, you know, growing up hearing him play piano concertos, then taking a break and putting on Joni Mitchell or Paul Simon, but it's also sort of the continuation of what he was doing as a teenager through my work. And the 2 big themes, one, I have not confessed this to anyone. You are my first confessees, if I'm the confessor. The first big tune is actually from a song that never saw the light of day. It was written for a project and abandoned, but it stuck in my head, so I thought, what better time to use it than now? And then the second theme, which you'll hear first in the horn and then later in a big coda, is the title track from an album called Where Are the Arms, which came out 11 years ago. And I only realized sort of retroactively that the reason I had chosen that song is that song, while on the album it's guitars, electric guitars and bass and voices and some strings and brass, the harmony is very much indebted to German church music. And so there is this sort of almost Ouroboros of German church music inspiring a Jewish kid to write a song, which then I used in this piano concerto. So that's what's happening in the first movement. That was a very long and belabored explanation. I'll try to be a little bit more concise as I continue. The second movement is about my grandmother, who fled Germany in 1939, fled the Nazis, ended up in Los Angeles. And this is really the movement that's about sort of intergenerational memory, and that sort of, I'm sure we all experience this feeling of things that we know and we don't know how we know them, and we, on some level, we have the feeling that they've been passed down genetically or spiritually. And so the language of this movement owes a debt to the music that was being written in the years leading up to her flight from Germany, the music of Alban Berg, who was someone who was very important to me when I was just out of college. And I remember encountering his music, and in particular his piano sonata, and feeling like, even though I had never heard this music, I had heard this music.
Huh.
And it's not, it's not the kind of music you're going to hear at the supermarket, sadly. And I remember thinking to myself, why does this feel so familiar? And then there's this, this other aspect, which I think I wrote about in the program note, which is my grandmother's sort of the challenge of reconciling her deep love of German literature and German music with the ways in which that body of work had been appropriated by the Third Reich to terrible, terrible ends. And ultimately, she found a way to reconcile that. She and I went to concerts right up until, just before she died in 2010. But the music sort of works its way a little bit backward through time until we arrive at the end of the movement with a very harmonically open sort of quasi-lullaby that wouldn't be out of place in the late 19th century of Germany, except that then some spirits intrude on it that come from the present. And that notion of lullaby feeds, I think, into the last movement, which is called Vera's Chicken-Powered Transit Machine, which is about my 3.5-year-old daughter and her great love of chicken in all forms for all meals, all times of day, sometimes in the middle of the night. I'm not going to tell you the story. It's in the printed program. But I think this last...
And it's adorable. Read it. Do read it.
This last movement is really about the sort of numinous inheritance from parent to child, and you look at your small child. At this point, I have two of them, 3.5 and 3 months, and I don't know what I'm passing down to them, and there's something humbling and kind of awe-inspiring about that. So the last movement is just all joy, all the time, and that's sort of it in a nutshell.
It's wonderful.
A very large nut.
Well, and there's one little bit there that I wanted to ask you about, because I'm really, really interested in memory and how memory creates who we are and how it's always changing and always inaccurate in some way, shape, or form. And that is that the second movement about your grandmother is called My Grandmother Knew Alban Berg, I believe is the name of it. She didn't, but she did know Arnold Schoenberg.
Yes, my grandmother knew Schoenberg, and she actually babysat for his children in Los Angeles.
And there's a cultural inheritance from Schoenberg to Berg as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that the title for me, and I may have written this in the note, but I think we're all familiar with the fallibility of memory, and there's something so beautiful that I think is being lost in our digital moment, where the computer knows what actually happened, but sometimes the ways in which our minds sort of reform and rewrite memory is both a healing process, and other times it's the opposite of a healing process. So I think that the fib in the title is, on the one hand, sort of speaking to that way in which memory is slippery. And then there's also the fact that my dad's childhood piano teacher, Jacob Gimpel, studied with Alban Berg. Okay. So we're actually one degree of separation from Berg. Also, I just think Alban Berg sounds better than saying my grandmother knew Arnold Schoenberg. And of course, that title is a shout out to the John Adams piece, My Father Knew Charles Ives. Yes. And John's father did not know Charles Ives, just to be clear.
So Oregon audiences first became familiar with you and your work, which is really at the intersection of composing, performing, journalism, writing, ethnography. Oregon audiences, I think, really became aware of this in 2018 when you were here for emergency shelter intake form.
Thank you.
And I'd like to talk first about that, about this work that you do that is, I think the word intersectional is so overused, and so I hate to use that word.
It's fine. You have a pass.
But that is touching so many different areas of humanity and creation and human life. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you get up and you just start writing in the morning, and sometimes it's music, sometimes it's a book, and...
Yeah, well, it's funny you mention that, because yesterday the wonderful composer Caroline Shaw, who's a friend and colleague, happens to be in town for a few days, and she and I were going for a little walk. and we passed some moss on some rocks, and she said, "Oh, I'm reading a book about moss right now." And I said, "For work or pleasure?" And she said, "I'm not sure." And this led to this conversation that we had where it's like, when you are an artist, you're trying to figure out the world through your work. So anything you read, if you find it interesting, it's probably going to end up in your work. So all of that is a sort of belabored way of saying that I filter basically all of my interests into my work, and I think over the last decade, that's taken a turn toward a lot more research-based work, and that coincided, whether coincidentally or not, with the end of my sort of heartbroken 20s, where I think developmentally I had written enough sad, boy got his heart broken songs. I met someone, I married her, and then I was like, well, my life is wonderful but boring, so I'd better look outside myself, just to find other things, other ways of it. I mean, I'm being a little bit glib, but also not. And so I think I started turning outward more and devoting myself to projects that required me to very often step inside the lives of people who have really, really different experiences than mine. And that is something that I think comes from my mom's side of, we've talked, of course, about my inheritance from my dad, but my mom is a psychologist and an extraordinary empath. And I think that my interest in human psychology and in negative capability, the ability to sort of disappear into someone else, comes very much from her. And I think that's sort of feeds through a lot of the projects that I've been working on, whether it was Emergency Shelter or Book of Travelers, where I took a 9,000-mile train trip in the aftermath of the 2016 election, or some upcoming projects that I might explore having to do with wildfires and Southern Oregon and the towns that have been decimated there.
Your role here at the Oregon Symphony has really changed since emergency intake. In fact, a role was created for you, and I asked when we talked the other day, what does it mean to be a creative chair? I know what a music director is, I know what a creative director, but you are the first creative chair at the Oregon Symphony.
Yeah, well, the genesis was that when we did Emergency Shelter, I hadn't worked with that many American orchestras, maybe 7 or 8, maybe 10. But the feeling that I had working with this orchestra was unlike any I'd ever had. And I've said this before, but I will say it again. This is the orchestra with the most one-to-one ratio of caliber of playing to humanity. It is the kindest orchestra that you will ever encounter, and they play their butts off. They're so good. And I think, in a landscape where local media has been totally decimated, I think sometimes we don't know just how good the orchestra is, but it's a really, really great orchestra. So coming out of that experience, being the freelancer who's always looking for the next gig, I asked to have a meeting with Scott Showalter and with Charles Calmer, and I said, hey, this was a great first date, can we do more together? And they said, we were thinking along the same lines, why don't you come up with a title for yourself? And I said, we were sitting in the lobby of the Heathman, and I said, creative chair. And they said, what's that? And I said, I don't know. They said, well, figure it out. So I think the short version is I'm another voice in the conversation. I bring with me some relationships both in the folk and indie rock world, and also in the new music scene in New York. I live here now. We moved 2 years ago by accident. We flew out for what was meant to be a week on March 8th, 2020. And you probably know what happened, but we never left. So we've been here ever since. That's a true story. But basically, I'm starting a couple different concert series. There's open music. We have a performance on Tuesday at Mississippi Studios with the incredible Missy Mazzoli. Her work
was delayed.
That was delayed.
Yeah.
A piece of hers was done in January. She, if you're not aware, she has been commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera to adapt George Saunders' novel Lincoln at the Bardo. And on Tuesday night, we're going to be in conversation where I will be doing very little talking. She'll be doing a lot of the talking, and we'll be hearing not only her music, but music of her mentors, the people she has mentored, and everyone in between, Bach, Britten, and also a reading by Karen Russell, the Pulitzer finalist, incredible fiction writer who lives here in town, whose short story Proving Up was the source material for Missy's third opera. She's 40 and she's already written 3 operas, and now she's writing 2 more. So anyway, if you're not doing anything Tuesday night, come to Mississippi Studios. It's an opportunity for composers to kind of dump their brains onto the stage while curating a live mixtape performed by our musicians. I think this one is going to be particularly special. So that's one of the things that I'm doing.
And there are 3, I think, this year.
Yes.
In the open music program. Kenji Bunch did the first one in the fall.
Yeah.
Kenji Bunch did the first, and then Missy. And the next one, I believe, is coming up in the first week in June.
Yes,
is that correct?
yeah, with the incredible Natalie Joachim, the Haitian-American songwriter and composer and flautist, and Pekka Kuusisto, incredible Finnish violinist, which, on the surface sounds like, what do those 2 people have in common? But they're both incredibly steeped in folk traditions, coming back to tonight's program. Pekka in Scandinavian folk music, Natalie with Haitian folk music. So I think that will be really fun. And then the other thing that we're doing under the sort of creative chair umbrella is 2 concerts at the Research Center.
Yeah, brand new Patricia Research Center for the Arts in Beaverton, which maybe you have heard
Has anyone
of.
gone yet? Is it gorgeous or is it gorgeous? Come on, just give us a better, it's gorgeous?
It's gorgeous, yeah. So both of these are going to be at the Research Center, the new Research Center.
Yeah, April 14th. This is a little bit of self-dealing, but I have a new album coming out called Magnificent Bird, which chronicles a year-long hiatus from the internet, which I completed in November of 2020. I made a record about that, so that will be April 14th with half of the orchestra, and then on April 15th, the next night, we will have the other half of the orchestra doing all water-themed music by Nico Muhly, whose scores you may have heard, films like The Reader. He's had 2 operas at the Met. Timo Andrus, who was just nominated for a couple Grammys. Andy Akiho, who was just nominated for a couple Grammys. Gabriella Smith, who has won a Grammy, I think. Inti Figgis Vizueta, who is a super up-and-coming, incredible composer who just had a big premiere with the LA Phil. Interspersed with Handel's water music, kind of back and forth between 21st century music and, of course, the timeless music of George Friedrich Handel.
And that's April 15th.
Yeah, so those are all things I'm very excited about.
You just mentioned something and just sort of brushed right over it, but I know that I sort of went, hey, wait a minute, and at least a few of you probably did as well. A year away from the internet. And you're just going to brush over that one. Okay, so many questions. The first one being, the first one is, what was the hardest thing about it? What was was it finding directions? Was it restaurant recommendations? What was the most difficult thing about not having the internet for a year?
Honestly, the hardest thing has been figuring out how to moderate coming back. Being off the internet was actually not hard. It was a total pleasure. I'm old enough, I realize many of you are older than I am, but I'm old enough to have grown up when the internet was not much of a thing. It was in its infancy. I did not have a smartphone until I was in my late 20s, so I have memories of navigating with a paper map and so on and so forth. And returning to all of those analog ways of dealing with the world, I was reminded, one, how much our sense of necessity is shaped by convenience. And when things are no longer convenient, very often we realize we don't need them. That was a big revelation. And also realizing how much of, and this is, I'm not saying anything that you don't already know, but how much of human interaction that might have seemed really trivial has been completely excised from our lives because of all the things that our devices do. And we talk an awful lot about the polarizing effect of social media, but I would argue that one of the things that is equally to blame for our sort of fractured and broken body politic is that we just don't interact with strangers because the computer, the smartphone has become the thing that does all of that, in place of. Anyway, I could talk about this for a long time, or you could just come to the concert on April 14th and we'll talk about it more then.
Just one more question about that. Was there one thing that happened that you said, that's it, I'm taking a year off? Or was it cumulative?
It was really cumulative. Well, there was a moment. It was when the IPCC report came out in 2018, which was the one that basically said we have 12 years to get our act together vis-a-vis climate change. And I blurted out to Emma, my partner, I said, efficiency equals debt. And, or I might have said convenience equals debt. And I was kind of trying in my brain to wrap my mind around this notion that the same way that we rationalize doing things online that we kind of know are societally destructive is, I think, connected to that same behavior vis-a-vis climate. And I just had this sense that my own addiction to convenience and efficiency, I mean, I was a horrible social media addict, and it was bad for my family, and it was bad for my work life, that I was going to learn a lot by kind of creating friction in a voluntary way. So I think if I had, I mean, it really was cumulative. The other moment was when I took this train trip in 2016. I did that without my phone. It was 13 days just talking to strangers on the train right after the 2016 election. And I remember thinking somewhere in the middle of that trip, this is really transformative. I should try being offline for longer. So it was both cumulative, and there were moments along the way that were really kind of specific inflection points.
Last week, the 2022-23 Oregon Symphony season was announced, and on that program is the next piece of yours that will be performed.
Yes, which is actually that's a piece called "The Right to Be Forgotten," which I have not written yet, but it has a title. Hey, it's a start, right? It's going to be called "The Right to Be Forgotten." And that's actually sort of a continued exploration of these questions about the internet, and also about ego, and the way that the internet sort of incentivizes us to think that scale has intrinsic value, that playing to 3,000 people is somehow more valuable than playing to 10 people. Yeah. And it's not just about musicians. It could be for a business owner whose general store is the hub of a community. I've been very much under the spell of a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift. Has anyone read The Gift? Anyone? One, two, three. Bravo to all of you. Did it change your life? No. Did you find it inscrutable? No. Well, it was a book that was very important for me, and the basic premise of this is that art exists in two economies, a market economy and a gift economy. Art can exist without the market, but where there is no gift, there is no art. The idea being that the reciprocity that occurs, I sing a song for you, your gratitude or even just your presence restores my spirit. It's not necessarily the applause, it's not fame, it's not money, it's your presence that completes the cycle of gift exchange. And that is so at odds with the sort of incentives of the internet, where it's like, how many thousands of likes did you get on Twitter today, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's one of the sort of animating ideas of this, the notion of the right to be forgotten is like, what does it mean to both want to be an artist and also to want to kind of live privately, and to not sort of perform every aspect of one's life, and not just from a personal standpoint, but really thinking societally, because it's not just artists who are being asked to perform their lives, it's teenagers and college kids and parents who are, posting pictures of their infants, and like, are they thinking about the fact that they're posting pictures of their children online? I don't know.
Yeah. This is so much fun, but they're actually starting to bring out the hook now.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're going to continue this conversation tomorrow.
Sounds great.
Sorry, guys. But you can watch this online. One other quick mention, I forgot to mention when we came out. Oh, by the way, I'm Brandi Parisi. I'm a producer and host at All Classical Portland. Among other things, I produce and host the Oregon Symphony broadcasts. And our most recent broadcast was Thursday evening of Agnello Desiderio performing the Concierto d'Aranjuez. That amazing program also had the centerpiece of Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony, an amazing work. If you missed it, I have good news. You can still hear it online in the on-demand section on our website for the next 2 weeks at allclassical.org. Tonight's concert as well will be broadcast later in April, so you can find the listings for that also, allclassical.org. Thank you all so much for coming out early. enjoy the concert. It's going to be just wonderful.
And I'm
Thank you.
so sorry that I talked so much.
That was great.